I am Kendra, 35 years old, and a high school history teacher. I was standing in my mother's immaculate suburban living room just hours after we laid my grandfather to rest, holding the only thing he managed to press into my palm before his final breath. It was a frayed leather-bound bank passbook. Before I could even process what it was, my mother snatched it right out of my fingers. With a look of pure disgust, she dropped it directly into the kitchen trash can, letting it land squarely on a paper plate covered in leftover potato salad. "It is old," she announced loudly, ensuring the entire room of gathered relatives could hear. "This should have stayed buried." What she did not realize was that reaching into that garbage to retrieve his final gift would soon trigger a federal fraud investigation that would tear down her entire fake reality. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who tried to bury your worth. Growing up in an affluent neighborhood in Atlanta, I always knew my place in the family hierarchy. My mother, Patricia, ran a successful local real estate agency funded entirely by my grandfather's initial investments. Her house was a monument to her obsession with status, with its spotless white leather sofas and imported marble countertops. Inside those perfectly painted walls, I was the designated disappointment. I chose to teach history at a public school instead of chasing corporate wealth. My younger sister Jasmine, on the other hand, was the undeniable golden child. Even at a funeral repast, Jasmine was dressed in a custom-tailored black designer dress that cost more than my monthly rent, crying perfectly timed tears while her husband Andre hovered nearby. Andre worked in finance and never missed an opportunity to mock my teacher salary or flex his expensive watches. My grandfather Joseph was the only person who saw through their polished facade. He was a self-made businessman who built a commercial real estate empire from the ground up. He had hands that showed decades of hard work and a mind that stayed sharp right until the very end. While my mother and sister spent his money as fast as he could make it, he taught me the value of integrity. When his health declined rapidly over the past year, Patricia and Jasmine suddenly became too busy to help. They were constantly traveling to luxury resorts or attending high society galas, claiming they could not bear to see him in such a state. So I drained my modest savings to pay for his specialized at-home hospice care. I spent countless nights sleeping in a stiff chair beside his bed, making sure he was comfortable holding his hand when the pain became too much. It was during one of those quiet, lonely nights, just 2 days before he passed, that he pulled me close. His breathing was shallow, but his eyes were incredibly focused. He reached under his mattress and pulled out a small, worn leather book, sliding it into my hands. "Keep this safe, Kendra," he whispered, his voice barely carrying across the room. "Do not let your mother see it. It is the only real thing left." I did not understand what he meant at the time. I simply tucked it into my purse and focused on keeping him comfortable until he took his final breath. Now we were back at my mother's house for the traditional repast. The caterers had set up an extravagant spread of food that nobody was really eating. The room was filled with the low hum of distant relatives and business associates offering empty condolences. I was exhausted, physically and emotionally drained from months of caregiving and the heavy grief of losing the only person who truly loved me unconditionally. I had stepped away from the crowd, retreating toward the kitchen island to find a moment of peace. I reached into my purse to find a tissue, and my fingers brushed against the leather cover of the passbook. I pulled it out, just wanting to feel something that belonged to him. I did not hear my mother approach. Patricia moved with a predatory grace, always hunting for an opportunity to assert control. She ripped the book from my hands so forcefully that the paper edges gave a slight tear. "What is this garbage?" she demanded, holding it away from me as if it were contaminated. "That belongs to me," I said, keeping my voice low to avoid making a scene. "Grandpa gave it to me before he died." Patricia let out a harsh, mocking laugh that instantly silenced the conversations nearby. Jasmine and Andre turned their attention toward us, stepping closer to enjoy the spectacle. "Do not be ridiculous, Kendra," my mother said, her tone dripping with condescension. My father barely knew what day it was toward the end. He probably thought it was a piece of trash. And that is exactly where it belongs. Without breaking eye contact with me, she held the passbook over the large stainless steel trash can and dropped it. I watched the dark leather tumble downward, landing with a soft thud on top of discarded napkins and greasy potato salad. The room went dead silent. Dozens of eyes shifted from the trash can to my face, waiting to see if the family scapegoat would finally break down and cry. I looked at my mother. Her chin was raised, a smug smile playing on her lips. She wanted me to run out of the house in tears, just like I had done when I was a teenager. She wanted to prove to everyone that I was weak and unstable. Jasmine stood behind her, examining her manicured nails, while Andre smirked, checking the time on his oversized Rolex. "Let her keep the trash," Pat Andre said, his voice carrying easily through the quiet room. "Jasmine already got the deed to the lake house this morning. Let the teacher have the old souvenirs. It is the least we can do since she cannot afford anything else." A few aunts and uncles exchanged uncomfortable glances, but no one stepped forward to defend me. They never did. In this family, wealth dictated respect, and I had none. I took a deep breath. The anger that usually burned in my chest was suddenly replaced by a profound, icy calm. I did not yell. I did not cry. I stepped forward, closing the distance between myself and the trash can. Slowly and deliberately, I rolled up the long sleeves of my only good black dress. I reached my hand straight into the garbage, pushing aside the wet food and discarded cups until my fingers wrapped around the soiled leather passbook. When I pulled it out, some of the potato salad smeared against my cuff, leaving an oily stain on the dark fabric. I calmly pulled a clean napkin from the counter and wiped the cover of the book clean, ignoring the collective gasp from the older relatives. "You are absolutely disgusting," my mother hissed, her smug expression faltering into genuine outrage. "You are embarrassing yourself in front of our guests over a piece of trash. Get out of my house before you ruin this gathering completely." I clutched the book tightly against my chest. "I will go," I said, my voice steady and clear. "But you should know that you just threw away the last piece of respect I had for you." I turned on my heel and walked straight toward the front door, not looking back, not rushing my steps. As I walked out into the cool afternoon air, I had no idea that the small, stained book in my hands held the power to destroy the empire my mother had stolen, and I had no idea that by tomorrow morning I would be sitting in a locked bank office with the FBI. I was halfway down the hallway, my hand trembling slightly against the potato salad-stained leather of the passbook, when a figure stepped out from the formal dining room, blocking my path to the front door. It was Andre. My sister Jasmine's husband stood tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a custom-tailored charcoal suit that probably cost more than my car. He leaned casually against the archway, with a smug grin, adjusting the heavy gold Rolex on his left wrist. He looked past me toward my mother, who was still fuming in the kitchen. "Let her keep the trash, Pat," he called out, his deep voice echoing off the high vaulted ceilings of the foyer. "Jasmine already got the deed to the lake house this morning. Let the teacher have the old souvenirs." I stopped dead in my tracks. The air in my lungs felt like it had instantly turned to glass. The lake house. My grandfather had built that modest wooden cabin with his own two hands 40 years ago. It was his sanctuary, his absolute favorite place in the entire world, and the one property he swore would always remain a shared family retreat. He had taught me how to fish off that rickety wooden dock when I was 7 years old. The thought of Jasmine owning it, Jasmine who hated the outdoors and complained about mosquito bites if she even stepped onto a patio, made my stomach turn. I looked back at my mother, who had now walked into the hallway, her arms crossed over her chest defensively. "When exactly did Grandpa sign over the lake house?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "He made the decision weeks ago," Patricia replied, not meeting my eyes directly. "He knew Jasmine and Andre were planning to expand their family, and they needed a solid real estate asset. It was the practical choice. You, on the other hand, are a single public school teacher, Kendra. You do not have the resources to maintain a waterfront property. It would just go to rot. The sheer audacity of her words struck me like a physical blow. I could not believe what I was hearing. You are talking to me about resources. I shot back, taking a step closer to her. Where were your resources for the last 6 months, Mother? Because while I was draining every single cent of my modest savings account to pay for his round-the-clock hospice care, you were nowhere to be found. The words poured out of me like a broken dam. I had kept my mouth shut for months, swallowing my anger to keep the peace for my grandfather, but I could not hold it back anymore. I maxed out 3 different credit cards to rent that hospital bed for his living room, I reminded her, my voice rising. I paid for his oxygen tanks, his pain management medication, and the specialized nurses because his own insurance had capped out. I took unpaid leave from my teaching job, risking my own career, so he would not have to die alone in a cold, sterile medical facility. And where were you and Jasmine? You were in Cabo San Lucas. You spent 2 straight weeks sipping premium margaritas in a luxury beachfront cabana while I was pureeing his food because he could no longer swallow solid meals. Right on cue, Jasmine drifted into the hallway, holding a massive crystal goblet filled to the brim with expensive red wine. She looked flawless, her makeup completely untouched by the supposed grief she had been displaying for the guests just moments before. She sighed dramatically, rolling her eyes as if my financial ruin was just a boring inconvenience. "Oh, please, Kendra, stop playing the martyr," she groaned, taking a delicate sip of her wine. "We had that vacation booked for 8 months. The doctor said he was stable when we left. Besides, we needed the self-care. Watching him decline was incredibly stressful for our mental health. You have always been so dramatic about everything. You chose to spend your money. No one forced you to play nurse." I stared at my younger sister, truly seeing her for exactly what she was. A hollow, selfish shell of a person wrapped in expensive designer labels. She was 32 years old and had never worked a hard day in her life, floating seamlessly from our grandfather's wallet to our mother's bank account, and finally landing safely in Andre's lucrative finance lifestyle. She did not know what it meant to sacrifice for someone you loved. None of them did. They viewed my grandfather as nothing more than a bank vault waiting to be cracked open. I tightened my grip on the small leather passbook, pressing it against my chest. "You are right, Jasmine," I said softly, shaking my head. "I chose to be there for him. And I would do it all over again, because at least I know he did not die surrounded by vultures." Jasmine's eyes flashed with sudden venom. The calm, spoiled princess facade dropped instantly. She stepped sharply toward me, her heels clicking aggressively on the hardwood floor. "Excuse me," she snapped. But before I could brace myself, she lunged forward. She did not even try to make it look like an accident. Jasmine shoved her shoulder hard against my chest and simultaneously tilted her wrist. The entire glass of dark crimson wine splashed directly onto my chest. I gasped as the cold liquid soaked instantly through the thin fabric of my black dress, running down my neck and pooling uncomfortably in my bra. The heavy crystal goblet slipped from her fingers and shattered into a dozen glittering pieces against the floor, splashing the remaining wine across my shins. The hallway went completely still. The chatter from the living room died down as a few relatives peered around the corner to see the commotion. I stood there shivering slightly, the sticky, sweet smell of fermented grapes rising heavy in the air. The wine had completely ruined the only formal morning dress I owned, a simple piece I had bought on clearance 5 years ago. I looked down at the dark red stains blossoming across the black fabric, feeling a deep, humiliating heat rise in my cheeks. But the true heartbreak came a second later. My mother rushed forward, pushing past me so roughly I stumbled into the wall. She dropped to her knees on the floor, completely ignoring the fact that I was soaked and shivering. "Oh my God, Jasmine, your shoes!" Patricia shrieked, her voice filled with genuine panic. She frantically grabbed a handful of cocktail napkins from a nearby side table and began dabbing at the tips of Jasmine's feet. "Did the wine get on the suede? These Louboutins are irreplaceable. Honey, do not move. Let me blot it out." Jasmine pouted, looking down at her mother scrubbing the floor. "I think a drop got on the left heel," she complained, kicking her foot out slightly. "It is ruined. Mom, she ruined my shoes." Andre stepped up, wrapping a protective arm around Jasmine's waist, glaring at me as if I was the one who had just assaulted his wife. "Look at what you did," he spat, shaking his head. "You are always causing a scene, Kendra. It is pathetic. You really need to leave before you embarrass yourself any further." I stood pinned against the hallway wall, watching this absurd, twisted display of priority. My grandfather was not even cold in the ground yet, and my family was mourning a pair of designer heels, while I stood dripping in wine, the family scapegoat as always. For 35 years, I had desperately craved their validation. I had chased straight A grades, earned 2 master degrees, and lived a life of quiet responsibility, hoping that one day they would look at me with the same fierce protective love my mother was currently directing at a piece of Italian leather. But in that exact moment, staring down at my mother crawling on the floor, the heavy fog of childhood longing finally lifted from my brain. I did not want their love anymore. I did not want anything to do with them. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not offer a single word of apology or defense. The time for arguing with these people was over. I reached down and carefully picked up my small black purse from the console table, making sure the stained leather passbook was tucked safely inside. I smoothed down the wet fabric of my dress, squaring my shoulders. I stepped right over the shattered glass, ignoring my mother and sister completely. I walked out the heavy oak front door, pushing it open and stepping out into the cool, crisp afternoon air. The heavy latch clicked shut behind me, sealing them inside their toxic little world. I walked down the driveway to my beat-up sedan, the wet dress clinging uncomfortably to my skin, but for the first time in my entire life, my chest felt incredibly light. I put the key in the ignition and the old engine sputtered to life. As I drove away from the sprawling manicured lawns of my mother's neighborhood, the adrenaline slowly began to fade, leaving behind an exhausting, hollow ache. I kept glancing at the passenger seat where the passbook lay. Why had he given it to me? Grandpa Joseph never did anything by accident. He was a meticulous man who kept ledgers and receipts for everything. Giving me a physical book, keeping it a secret from my mother. All of these actions pointed to something much larger. I thought about Jasmine getting the lake house deed. It felt profoundly wrong. Why would he willingly sign away his legacy to people who abandoned him in his darkest hour? By the time I reached my small one-bedroom apartment, the sun had set. I peeled off the ruined dress, throwing it directly into the trash bin under my kitchen sink. It felt fitting to leave it behind, just like I was leaving them behind. I took a long, hot shower, trying to wash away the smell of the wine. When I finally sat on my worn sofa, I picked up the passbook again. I knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow morning I was going to the bank to close this account and use whatever small amount was left inside to start paying off my massive debt. I set my alarm for 7 in the morning, completely oblivious to the fact that when I handed this book to the teller, my life was going to change forever. The alarm clock buzzing at 7 in the morning felt like a physical strike to my head. I had barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother dropping my grandfather's legacy into the trash and heard my brother-in-law laughing about the lake house. I dragged myself out of bed and walked into my small kitchen to make a pot of cheap coffee. Sitting at the tiny laminate table, I opened my laptop and pulled up my banking app. The numbers staring back at me were a harsh reminder of my current reality. My primary checking account had exactly $42.15 left. My 3 credit cards were entirely maxed out, blinking with red warning banners about missed minimum payments. This financial ruin was the direct result of paying for Grandpa Joseph's at-home hospice care. I had covered his specialized nurses, his daily oxygen deliveries, and his expensive pain medication out of my own pocket. His health insurance had hit its limit months ago, and my family claimed they simply did not have the liquid cash to help. Meanwhile, they were busy sipping premium cocktails in Mexico and buying luxury vehicles. My rent was due in exactly 4 days, and my public school teacher salary would not hit my account for another 2 weeks. I was officially drowning. I looked at the frayed leather passbook sitting on my kitchen counter. The potato salad oil from the trash can had left a permanent dark smudge on the cover. I picked it up and opened the stiff pages. There were a few handwritten deposit entries from decades ago, but no current balance was listed. I did not expect to find a massive fortune in this ancient account. My grandfather was a brilliant self-made man, but he also grew up in an era where people hid emergency cash under mattresses. I figured this was a forgotten rainy day fund. Maybe it had a few $1,000s in it, just enough to pay my rent, keep my electricity from being shut off, and buy me some time to figure out my next move. That was all I needed. I got dressed in a simple beige sweater and dark slacks, grabbed my purse, and drove across town to the main branch of First Fidelity Bank. This was the institution my grandfather had used for his commercial real estate business for over 40 years. It was an imposing stone building situated right in the heart of the financial district, featuring towering marble columns and heavy brass front doors. Pushing those heavy doors open, I stepped into the sprawling climate-controlled lobby. The air smelled of expensive cologne floor wax and money. Wealthy clients in tailored suits sat in plush leather waiting chairs reading the morning financial papers. I felt entirely out of place in my off-the-rack clothes carrying a stained relic from a dead man. I walked over to the velvet ropes and waited in line for the next available teller, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. After a few minutes, a young woman with a tight blonde ponytail and a shiny gold name tag that read, Megan, waved me over to her window. "Good morning," she said with a bright, practiced smile. "How can I help you today?" I placed the passbook on the cool marble counter and slid it beneath the glass partition. "Good morning," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady and professional. "My grandfather passed away recently. He gave me this passbook before he died. I would like to check the balance and close out the account, please." Megan picked up the book. She noticed the greasy stain immediately, and her nose wrinkled slightly in distaste. She discreetly grabbed a sanitizing wipe from a container beneath her counter and gave the leather cover a quick rub before opening it. I felt a flush of embarrassment heat my cheeks, but I kept my face completely blank. "Let us see what we have here," Megan murmured, her fingers flying across her mechanical keyboard. The clicking sound echoed sharply in my ears. I watched her screen from my side of the counter. I could not see the actual numbers, but I could see the blue glow reflecting off her wire-rimmed glasses. She hit the enter key. Nothing happened. She frowned, leaning closer to the monitor. "Let me try that again," she said, sounding slightly confused. "These older accounts sometimes need a manual override." She typed the long string of faded numbers stamped on the inside of the passbook again. Her typing was slower this time, much more deliberate. She hit enter. A heavy second passed. I held my breath, wondering if the account had already been drained by my mother. Patricia had legally acquired power of attorney during his final weeks when he was too medicated to fight back. It would make perfect sense for her to have discovered this hidden account and emptied it, leaving me with nothing but a worthless piece of paper. The thought made my chest tighten with a familiar burning anger. But what happened next did not make sense. The soft blue glow illuminating Megan's face suddenly shifted. A bright, glaring red box popped up on her monitor, casting a harsh light over her features. I heard a loud warning beep emit from her computer terminal. It was a sharp, aggressive sound that made the customer at the next window turn his head to look at us. Megan stopped breathing. Her eyes went incredibly wide, staring intently at the text inside that red box. All the practiced customer service cheer completely vanished from her face, replaced by raw, unadulterated panic. Her hands hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly. "Is there a problem?" I asked, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the sudden silence of the lobby. Did my mother already close it? Megan did not answer me. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously around the bank lobby before locking onto me. Her gaze was completely different now. She looked at me as if I was holding a live explosive. She slowly pushed her chair back and stood up. Her voice dropped to a frantic, terrified whisper. "Please stay right here, Mom. Do not move." Before I could ask her what was going on, she turned and practically sprinted away from her station, abandoning her open cash drawer. I watched in total bewilderment as she bolted across the polished marble floor, heading straight toward the branch manager's large glass-walled office at the back of the bank. I stood frozen at the teller window, watching Megan practically throw herself against the heavy glass door of the manager office. She did not even bother to knock gently. She pushed her way inside, interrupting whatever meeting was taking place. The branch manager was a man named Mr. Harrison. I recognized him from the few times I had accompanied my grandfather to the bank years ago, when his mind was still sharp and his stride was still strong. Mr. Harrison was a distinguished-looking man in his late 50s, always impeccably dressed in custom navy suits and known for his absolute unflappable calm. He was the kind of banker who handled multi-million-dollar commercial loans before his morning coffee. But right now, as Megan shoved a printed slip of paper across his wide mahogany desk, that calm shattered completely. Even from 50 feet away across the expansive marble lobby, I could see the exact moment the color drained from Mr. Harrison's face. He snatched a sleek silver tablet from his desk, his eyes darting frantically from the illuminated screen to the piece of paper Megan had given him. He stood up so fast, his heavy leather chair slammed into the wall behind him, knocking a framed diploma off balance. He marched out of his office, leaving Megan trembling near the doorway with her hands covering her mouth. He walked across the lobby with a brisk, stiff gait, his eyes locked onto me like a laser. The few wealthy clients sitting in the waiting area turned their heads, sensing the sudden shift in the atmosphere. The gentle hum of the bank seemed to quiet down, dropping into a tense, heavy silence. My heart began to pound against my ribs, beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. I looked down at the stained leather passbook still sitting on the marble counter. What had my grandfather done? Had he left me an account with massive negative funds? Was I somehow liable for a huge corporate debt he had hidden from the family? Or worse, had my mother somehow anticipated this? Patricia was a ruthless real estate agent who knew every loophole in the system. She had legally acquired power of attorney during his final weeks when he was too heavily medicated to fight back. Had she already reported this specific passbook stolen? Was this a setup to frame me for financial theft? It would be exactly the kind of vicious, calculated move my mother would make to ensure I was completely destroyed and removed from the inheritance picture forever. "Ms. Kendra Joseph," he said as he reached the window. His voice was remarkably tight, completely stripped of the usual warm banker pleasantries he used with my grandfather. "I need you to gather your belongings and step into my office immediately. Please do not make a scene." I wanted to ask him what was going on, but the sheer intensity in his eyes stopped the words in my throat. I picked up my cheap worn purse and the stained passbook, my hands shaking slightly. I followed him across the polished floor, feeling the weight of a dozen stairs boring into my back. Every step felt incredibly heavy, like I was walking underwater. I thought about my brother-in-law, Andre. Andre worked in high-level corporate finance. He had extensive connections in the banking world. He had laughed so casually yesterday when Jasmine bragged about getting the deed to the lake house. Did Andre know about this account? Did he place a fraud alert on my name just to humiliate me and get me arrested? We stepped into his spacious office. It was a beautiful, intimidating room with floor-to-ceiling glass walls that offered a full view of the bustling bank lobby. The air conditioning in here was turned up high, making the sweat on the back of my neck turn ice cold. But the moment I crossed the threshold, Mr. Harrison did something completely unexpected. He reached up and grabbed the heavy control cord for the privacy blinds. With one swift, aggressive yank, the thick vertical slats snapped shut, plunging the room into dim shadows and completely cutting us off from the outside world. The lobby disappeared from view, leaving me boxed in. "Please sit down, Ms. Joseph," he said, gesturing to a heavy leather guest chair, but I did not sit. I turned around to face him, my instincts screaming that something was terribly wrong. As I turned, I heard a sound that made my blood run absolutely ice cold. It was the heavy, distinct metallic click of the deadbolt sliding into place. He had locked the door from the inside. "Mr. Harrison?" I started, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the absolute terror rising in my chest. "Why did you lock the door? What is the problem with my grandfather account? You are scaring me." He did not answer me. He did not even look at me. He walked behind his large desk, his breathing shallow and erratic. He placed his hands flat on the polished wood, leaning his weight forward, as if his legs might give out at any second. He stared down at his silver tablet again, his eyes wide with an emotion I could only describe as pure dread. He reached out with a trembling finger and pressed the red intercom button on his telephone console. "Megan," he said, his voice shaking so badly it barely sounded like him. "Call the police immediately. Tell them we have a code red federal financial anomaly. And tell the security guards to lock the front lobby doors right now. Do not let anyone else in, and absolutely do not let anyone out until law enforcement arrives." He released the button and finally looked up at me. His expression was a terrifying mixture of fear, disbelief, and pity. I stood in the middle of the locked room, clutching my cheap purse and the potato salad-stained passbook, realizing with absolute mounting horror that I was completely trapped. I was a 35-year-old public school teacher with $42 to my name, and I was about to be arrested for something I did not even understand. The minutes stretching out inside that locked office felt like hours. I sat rigidly on the edge of the leather guest chair, my knuckles turning white as I gripped my purse. Mr. Harrison paced back and forth behind his desk, wiping sweat from his forehead with a monogrammed handkerchief. He refused to make eye contact with me. The heavy silence was only broken by the muffled sounds of the bank lobby outside. Suddenly, the frantic energy in the building shifted. Through the small gaps in the closed window blinds, I saw the unmistakable flash of red and blue police lights pulling up to the front entrance. Heavy footsteps approached the office. Someone pounded firmly on the thick glass door. Mr. Harrison practically lunged forward to turn the deadbolt. Two uniformed city police officers stepped inside, their hands resting cautiously on their duty belts. They looked at me and then at the banker. But before anyone could speak, another figure appeared in the doorway, smoothly pushing past the local cops. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man, wearing a sharp gray suit and a completely unreadable expression. He did not look like a beat cop. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a leather wallet, flipping it open to display a gold shield and an identification card. "I am Special Agent Rollins," he announced, his voice calm and authoritative. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division. Mr. Harrison, you can step outside and let your lobby staff know the lockdown is lifted. The police will secure the perimeter. I need to speak with Ms. Joseph alone." My stomach dropped entirely. The FBI. I had spent my entire life following the rules, paying my taxes on a meager teacher salary and keeping my head down. Now a federal agent was standing in a locked room with me. I braced myself for the Miranda warning. I fully expected him to pull out a pair of handcuffs and tell me I was going heavily into debt and going to federal prison. Instead, Agent Rollins closed the door behind the local police and pulled up a chair, sitting directly across from me. He looked down at the stained leather passbook resting on my lap. He did not pull out cuffs. He did not read me my rights. He pulled out a small notepad. "You can relax, Kendra," he said softly, his tone completely shifting from the hard edge he used with the banker. "You are not under arrest. In fact, you are the exact missing puzzle piece we have been desperately looking for over the past 8 months." I stared at him, completely bewildered. "I do not understand," I stammered, my voice trembling. "I just came here to close my grandfather account so I could pay my rent. I have $42 in my checking account. I am not a criminal." Agent Rollins offered a small, sympathetic smile. "I know you are not," he said. "We have been closely monitoring your grandfather Joseph and his financial empire for quite some time. The account number stamped inside that little book you are holding is not a standard savings account. It is an encrypted cipher. When the teller entered it into the system today, it triggered an automatic federal freeze that my division set up months ago." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Joseph was a brilliant commercial real estate mogul, Kendra. But over the last 5 years, his offshore corporate accounts have been bleeding massive amounts of liquid cash. Someone has been systematically draining his empire using a highly sophisticated network of shell companies and forged power of attorney documents. My mind started racing, spinning the details together. 5 years. My mother, Patricia, had convinced everyone that her real estate business was booming over the last 5 years. Jasmine had suddenly upgraded her lifestyle, buying designer clothes and taking lavish luxury vacations. And Andre worked as a senior portfolio manager at an aggressive corporate finance firm. He knew exactly how to move money without leaving an obvious trail. But my mother only got power of attorney a few months ago. When Grandpa got really sick, I argued, trying to make sense of the timeline. Agent Rollins nodded slowly. That was the legal one, he corrected. The one formally filed with the state. The documents used to drain the offshore accounts were forged years ago. Someone close to him, someone who had easy access to his private home office and his signature, has been robbing him blind. Your grandfather realized it late in the game. He knew he was surrounded by vultures, but he also knew that if he confronted them without an ironclad backup, they would simply destroy the evidence and claim he was suffering from dementia. Agent Rollins pointed a finger at the passbook in my lap. The thieves thought they wiped out all the digital ledgers. They thought they covered their tracks completely. What they did not know was that Joseph kept an analog backup. That passbook is the master ledger. It contains the original UN-tampered transaction history and the access codes to a physical safety deposit box right here in this bank. He gave it to you because you were the only person in the family he could actually trust. You are not a suspect, Kendra. You are the sole victim of a massive familial theft. I looked down at the dark potato salad stain on the leather cover. My mother had thrown this into the garbage. She had literally thrown away the federal evidence that was going to put her in prison. She had no idea what it actually was. She just saw something old and assumed it was worthless because she only valued things that sparkled and carried a designer label. I felt a sudden wave of vindication wash over me, so powerful it almost knocked the breath out of my lungs. For 35 years, I was the family scapegoat. I was the loser who chose a public school classroom over a corporate boardroom. I was the one they mocked and belittled at every family gathering. But my grandfather had seen me. He had chosen me to be his sword to cut down the rot in our family. We need you to help us finish this, Agent Rollins said, his voice pulling me back to the present. We have been building a solid case, but these people are incredibly slippery. However, they are also getting incredibly desperate. What do you mean, desperate? I asked, gripping the passbook tighter. Agent Rollins' expression hardened. His eyes locked onto mine, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The offshore accounts were quietly frozen late last week when your grandfather passed away, he explained. The thieves suddenly found themselves completely cut off from the illicit funds they had been living on. They panicked. He paused, letting the gravity of the situation settle into the quiet office. Yesterday afternoon, we intercepted an unauthorized wire transfer request, attempting to bypass the freeze using a secondary forged signature. Yesterday afternoon, I repeated, my mind flashing back to the timeline of the funeral. Yesterday afternoon, we were at the church. Exactly, Agent Rollins said, leaning back in his chair. While you were sitting in the front pew of the church, crying and watching your grandfather's casket being lowered into the ground, someone in your immediate family was using their cell phone to try and wire $2.5 million straight out of his estate to an untraceable account in the Cayman Islands. They are making major mistakes, Kendra, and with that book in your hands, we are finally going to catch them. I walked out of the bank with the leather passbook buried at the very bottom of my purse, covered by my wallet and an old receipt. Agent Rollins had specifically instructed me to act completely normal, to take the book home, and to wait for his call. He needed time to secure the federal warrants for the safety deposit box. Walking back to my beat-up sedan, the bright morning sunlight felt completely surreal. My entire reality had shifted in the span of an hour. For my entire life, I had believed my family was just toxic and superficial. Now I knew they were actively criminal. The people who had mocked me for being poor were the exact same people stealing millions from a dying man. The drive back to my apartment complex was a blur. I gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. My mind was racing through every interaction, every dismissive comment, and every lavish purchase my mother and sister had made over the last 5 years. I pulled into my assigned parking spot beneath the peeling carport of my building. I just needed to get inside, lock my door, and process everything. I grabbed my purse and walked toward the stairwell of my second-floor walk-up. As I climbed the concrete steps, I heard hushed, urgent voices echoing down the narrow hallway. My stomach tightened instinctively. I turned the corner and stopped cold, standing directly in front of my apartment door, acting as if they owned the hallway, were my mother, Patricia, my sister, Jasmine, and my brother-in-law, Andre. The sight of them in my modest apartment building was jarring. My mother was wearing a pristine white cashmere coat that practically screamed wealth against the backdrop of my neighbor's scuffed doors. Jasmine was nervously tapping her designer heel against the cheap linoleum floor, while Andre aggressively checked his phone, his jaw tight with obvious tension. They never visited me. In the 5 years I had lived in this apartment, not one of them had ever stepped foot inside. Now they were huddled around my door, like a pack of wolves waiting for a meal. As soon as my mother saw me, her entire demeanor shifted. The arrogant sneer she had worn yesterday when she dropped the passbook into the trash was completely gone. Instead, she plastered on a tight artificial smile that did not reach her eyes. She practically lunged forward to greet me. "Kendra, sweetheart," she cooed, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet tone I had not heard since I was a child. "We have been waiting for you. Where have you been so early in the morning?" I stood my ground, clutching my purse against my side. "I had some errands to run," I answered, keeping my voice neutral. "What are you doing here? You never come to my apartment." Jasmine stepped forward, linking her arm through our mother's. She looked incredibly pale beneath her expensive makeup. "We just felt terrible about yesterday, Kendra," she said, offering a weak, trembling smile. Tensions were just so high after the funeral. Everyone was emotional. We wanted to come over and properly apologize. I stared at them, my mind flashing back to the FBI agent's words. Yesterday afternoon, someone tried to wire $2.5 million out of the estate. They were not here to apologize. They were here because they were panicked. They were cut off. "I appreciate the apology," I said slowly, watching their reactions carefully. "But I am very tired. I just want to go inside and rest." I stepped forward to unlock my door, but Andre smoothly slid his large frame in front of the deadbolt, blocking my path. He forced a chuckle that sounded hollow and strained in the narrow hallway. "Hold on a second, Kendra," he said, his voice laced with forced casualness. "Do not be in such a rush. We actually came to ask you a small favor." My mother clasped her hands tightly together in front of her cashmere coat. "Yes, a very small favor," she chimed in, her eyes darting nervously toward my purse. "You see, I was going through some of your grandfather's old photos this morning, and I decided I really want to put together a memorial scrapbook for the family, something we can all cherish." "A scrapbook," I repeated, my voice flat. My mother had never crafted a single thing in her entire life. She hired people to wrap her Christmas presents. "Yes, a scrapbook," she insisted, nodding quickly. "And I remembered that silly old bank book you pulled out of the trash yesterday. I know it is completely worthless financially, but it has his handwriting in it. It has deep sentimental value to me. I was hoping I could just take it off your hands to use in the memory book." The lie was so incredibly transparent, it almost made me laugh. Yesterday it was garbage. Yesterday I was disgusting for pulling it out of the potato salad. Today it had deep sentimental value. The puzzle pieces Agent Rollins had laid out for me in that locked bank office snapped together with blinding clarity. They knew. They had tried to access the offshore accounts yesterday, realized everything was frozen, and panicked. They must have realized that the only piece of the puzzle missing, the only thing that could permanently link them to the stolen funds or unlock the physical vault, was the master ledger they had foolishly thrown away. I looked directly into my mother's eyes. The desperation hiding behind her fake smile was palpable. She was standing on the edge of a cliff and she knew it. I do not have it, I lied smoothly, my voice steady. I threw it away. The silence that followed was absolute. All three of them froze, completely stunned by my answer. Jasmine's jaw actually dropped open, and Andre's phone slipped slightly in his grip. You what? My mother hissed, the sweet facade instantly vanishing. I threw it away, I repeated, shrugging my shoulders. Like you said yesterday, it was just an old piece of trash. It was stained with potato salad and wine. I dumped it in the dumpster behind the building when I got home last night. Panic, pure and unadulterated, erupted in the hallway. Jasmine let out a sharp gasp, grabbing Andre's arm. You cannot be serious, she shrieked, her voice echoing loudly. You threw it in the dumpster. Are you an idiot, Kendra? Do you know what you just did? Andre shoved Jasmine's hand away, his face flushing dark red with sudden explosive anger. You are lying, he barked, taking a threatening step toward me. He pointed a thick finger directly at my face, dropping all pretense of politeness. You did not throw it away. Where is the book, Kendra? Give it to us right now. I stood perfectly still, my heart hammering against my ribs, but I refused to break eye contact. I am not lying, I said, keeping my tone cold and detached. It is gone. And if it was so important, maybe you should not have thrown it in the garbage in the first place. Now get out of my way, Andre. I want to go inside. My mother grabbed my arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging painfully into my skin through my sweater. Listen to me, you stupid, ungrateful girl. She growled, her face inches from mine. That book belongs to the estate. It belongs to me as the executor. You are going to go into your apartment, you are going to find it, and you are going to hand it over right this second. Or I swear to God, I will make sure you regret it for the rest of your miserable life. I looked down at her hand gripping my arm. I felt the heavy weight of the passbook sitting at the bottom of my purse pressing against my hip. They were thieves. They were criminals who had stolen my grandfather's legacy, and now they were threatening me in the hallway of my own home. I slowly reached up and grabbed my mother's wrist, prying her fingers off my arm with a strength that surprised both of us. Do not touch me again, Patricia, I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. I am not a child you can bully anymore. Patricia rubbed her wrist, looking genuinely shocked by my physical defiance. She had spent 35 years treating me like a submissive punching bag, and she did not know how to process the sudden resistance. But before she could formulate a response, Andre stepped up to take her place. He closed the remaining distance between us, using his height and broad shoulders to completely box me in against my front door. The heavy scent of his expensive designer cologne was suffocating in the tight, narrow space of the apartment hallway. He leaned down until his face was inches from mine, his jaw set in a hard, aggressive line. You think you are being smart, Kendra? He sneered, his voice a low, menacing rumble. You think because you spent a few months wiping the old man's mouth, you are entitled to hold his property hostage. Let me explain exactly how this is going to play out for you. I did not flinch. I kept my eyes locked on his, waiting for the threat I knew was coming. I work for one of the most powerful wealth management firms in this city. He continued, tapping his thick index finger against the doorframe right next to my head. I have an entire department of corporate lawyers on my speed dial. Lawyers who specialize in estate law and financial fraud. Do you know what it looks like when a financially struggling relative isolates an elderly man in his final months? It looks like elder financial abuse. It looks like a desperate, broke teacher trying to manipulate a dying man into giving her money. He paused, letting the heavy accusation hang in the stale hallway air. We know you maxed out your credit cards, Kendra. We know you are practically facing eviction. If you do not hand over that passbook right now, I will call my legal team and I will have them file a massive civil and criminal suit against you for elder abuse. I will bury you in so much litigation you will not even be able to afford a cup of coffee, let alone a defense attorney. The sheer audacity of his projection was breathtaking. He was standing there actively participating in the theft of millions of dollars from his own grandfather, and he was threatening to frame me for his exact crimes. I stared at him, mapping out the intricate web of lies they must have woven to cover their tracks. They had probably already planned to use me as their scapegoat if anything went wrong with their offshore transfers. Since I was the only one physically in the house providing medical care, I was the perfect target to take the fall. And that is not all, Andre pushed, leaning in even closer to ensure I felt the full weight of his intimidation. A formal felony investigation for defrauding a senior citizen will trigger an automatic review by the State Board of Education. They do not let felons teach high school history, Kendra. I will have your teaching license permanently revoked by Monday morning. You will lose your job, your apartment, and everything you have ever worked for. All over a stupid leather book. Right on cue. Jasmine stepped out from behind her husband, placing a trembling hand on his arm. She looked at me with wide, tear-filled eyes, performing the role of the heartbroken peacemaker flawlessly. Please, Kendra, she begged, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured emotion. Why are you doing this to us? Grandpa is gone. We are all grieving. Why are you trying to tear this family apart over some old garbage? She reached out as if to gently touch my shoulder, but I shifted my weight away from her, pressing my back firmly against the wood of my door. Just give Andre the book, Jasmine pleaded, a single heavy tear rolling down her perfectly powdered cheek. If you are that desperate for money, we can help you. We are not monsters. Patricia nodded eagerly in the background, sensing an opening. Yes, we will write you a check today for $3,000. Jasmine continued, her voice dropping to a soothing, patronizing pitch. Just to help you clear those credit cards and pay your rent. Please do not make Andre destroy your life. We are family, Kendra. We should be supporting each other, not fighting in the hallway like common criminals. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. In any other reality, if I had not spent the morning sitting in a locked bank office with a federal agent, their combined assault would have absolutely broken me. The threat of losing my teaching license, the one thing I was truly proud of, and the only thing that gave me independence, would have sent me into a blind panic. I would have run inside, grabbed the book out of my purse, and handed it over just to make the nightmare stop. I would have thanked them profusely for the $3,000 while they walked away with a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. But I was not in that reality anymore. I had seen the man behind the curtain, and all of their terrifying threats suddenly sounded incredibly hollow and pathetic. They were not powerful predators. They were cornered rats. I looked at Andre, thick fingers still pointing aggressively near my face. I looked at Jasmine, fake tears streaking her expensive foundation, and my mother, desperate, calculating eyes darting toward my purse. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. It was not a happy smile. It was the kind of smile that made Andre slightly pull back his hand and step half a pace away. You are going to sue me? I asked, my voice echoing loudly in the quiet residential hallway. You are going to bring the full weight of a corporate legal team down on a public school teacher over a piece of trash that Patricia threw into a plate of leftover potato salad yesterday afternoon. Does that really make logical sense to you, Andre? His jaw tightened, his dark eyes narrowing. Do not test me, Kendra. Hand it over right now. I let out a soft, genuine laugh that seemed to deeply unsettle all three of them. Jasmine dropped her hand from Andre's arm, her fake tears instantly drying up as her confusion grew. You guys are amazing, I said, shaking my head slowly. You really are. The legal threats, the manufactured tears, the fake concern about my financial well-being. It is quite a performance. I almost believed you cared about me for a second. But you are wasting your time. What are you talking about? My mother snapped, stepping forward again, her patience completely evaporating. Stop playing games and open the door. Give us the book. I am not playing games, Mother, I replied, my voice dropping to a dead serious whisper. I told you the truth earlier, but you did not want to believe it. I do not have the passbook. I did not throw it in the dumpster out back. I paused, letting the heavy suspense build as they stared at me. The silence in the hallway was so thick you could cut it with a knife. I took it to First Fidelity Bank this morning, I said, clearly enunciating every single word so there could be no misunderstanding. I tried to close the account just like you suggested yesterday so I could pay my bills. But the teller could not do it. She told me the account was completely locked. And then she called the branch manager. The color completely drained from Andre's face. The aggressive dominant posture he had been holding melted away in a split second, leaving a pale, terrified man in a very expensive suit. Jasmine let out a sharp, strangled gasp, quickly covering her mouth with her hand. My mother literally stumbled backward, hitting the painted wall of the hallway as if she had been physically shoved in the chest. What did the manager do? Andre croaked, his voice suddenly thin and reedy, completely stripped of its former corporate bravado. He kept the book. I lied smoothly, my face a mask of complete innocence. He said there was some sort of federal freeze on the serial number, and he had to surrender it to the authorities for a formal audit of the entire estate. So you see, Andre, you cannot sue me for the book, because I do not have it. The bank does. And they seemed very interested in whoever has been accessing the accounts lately. I watched the realization hit them like a runaway freight train. The master ledger, the only piece of physical evidence that could unravel their entire 5-year offshore fraud scheme, was now sitting safely out of their reach. They had no idea the FBI was actually already involved in building a case, but the mere mention of a federal freeze and a formal bank audit was enough to send them into absolute freefall. No, my mother whispered, shaking her head frantically, her perfectly styled hair falling into her eyes. No, 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 you stupid, ignorant girl. What have you done? You ruined everything. Andre spun around, pulling his phone from his suit pocket with violently shaking hands. We have to call the lawyers, he stammered, pushing past Jasmine and completely ignoring my mother. We have to get ahead of this immediately. If they audit the offshore accounts and trace the wire transfers, we are finished. We need to leave the country, Patricia. Jasmine began to hyperventilate, her chest heaving as she grabbed the lapels of Andre's suit jacket, her designer nails digging into the fabric. Are we going to jail, Andre? She cried, her voice shrill and piercing with genuine panic this time. Tell me we are not going to jail. I cannot go to jail. I did not wait to hear his answer. While they were completely consumed by their own rapidly unspooling nightmare, I simply turned around, slipped my key into the deadbolt, and opened my door. I stepped inside my quiet, safe apartment and pulled the heavy door shut behind me. I threw the deadbolt, locked the chain, and leaned my forehead against the cool wood. I stood there listening to the absolute chaos unfolding in the hallway. My mother was sobbing hysterically, screaming at Andre to fix it. Andre was shouting into his phone, pacing heavily back and forth outside my door. Jasmine was wailing about her reputation, her lake house, and her future. I walked into my small kitchen, pulled the passbook out from the bottom of my purse, and set it gently on the counter next to my coffee pot. I had never felt so powerful and entirely free in my entire life. They were finally running scared, and the best part was that the trap had not even fully sprung yet. Tomorrow morning I was going back into that subterranean bank vault with Agent Rollins, and I was going to find out exactly what else my grandfather had left behind to ensure their total destruction. The next morning, I walked back through the heavy brass doors of First Fidelity Bank, but this time I was not alone. Agent Rollins walked beside me, dressed in the same sharp gray suit, projecting an air of absolute authority that made the bank lobby part like the Red Sea. I had the potato salad-stained passbook securely tucked inside my purse, along with the small brass key I had discovered hidden deep within the binding the night before. Mr. Harrison was waiting for us near his office, looking significantly more composed than he had the previous day. He greeted us with a stiff professional nod, bypassing the pleasantries completely. He led us past the teller windows and toward a heavy reinforced steel door at the back of the building. We are heading down to the subterranean vault, he explained, his voice hushed as he punched a complex code into the keypad. Your grandfather secured one of our maximum security deposit boxes decades ago. It requires dual authentication to open. The heavy steel door clicked and hissed open, revealing a wide staircase that descended deep into the foundation of the building. The air grew noticeably cooler with every step we took, smelling faintly of old paper and ozone. I followed Mr. Harrison and Agent Rollins, feeling a strange mixture of anticipation and profound sadness. My grandfather had built this incredible hidden fortress to protect his legacy from his own flesh and blood. It was a brilliant move, but it was also a tragic reflection of how completely broken our family truly was. We reached the bottom of the stairs and faced another massive circular steel door that looked like it belonged on a submarine. Mr. Harrison turned a large combination dial and pulled a heavy lever. The vault door swung open silently on perfectly oiled hinges. Inside, the walls were lined from floor to ceiling with hundreds of rectangular metal boxes. The quiet down here was absolute. It felt like walking into a mausoleum. Mr. Harrison led us down a narrow aisle, stopping in front of a section of larger boxes near the very back. The cipher matched box number 842, he said, pointing to a long metal drawer at chest height. He pulled a master key from his pocket and inserted it into the left keyhole. I reached into my purse and pulled out the small brass key. My hands were shaking slightly. For my entire life, I had been told I was the irresponsible one, the daughter who could not be trusted with the family business, the sister who was too emotionally fragile to handle real money. Yet here I was standing in a federal bank vault, holding the only key that could unlock an empire. I inserted the brass key into the right keyhole. On my count, Mr. Harrison instructed. 1, 2, 3. We turned our keys simultaneously. The internal locking mechanism clicked loudly, echoing in the quiet vault. Mr. Harrison stepped back, gesturing for me to take the lead. I grasped the metal handle and pulled. The long, heavy drawer slid out smoothly on its tracks. I do not know what I was expecting to find inside. Maybe stacks of banded $100 bills, maybe heavy gold bars or bearer bonds. I had seen enough movies to expect a dramatic display of hidden wealth. But when I looked down into the long metal box, there was no cash. There was no gold. Instead, the box was filled entirely with neatly stacked manila envelopes. They were thick and heavy, packed tightly together. Sitting right on top of the stack, resting directly in the center, was a small, sleek black flash drive and a leather-bound journal. I reached in and picked up the journal. It was identical in size and shape to the passbook, but the leather was pristine and untouched by age or potato salad. I opened the cover. The first page was dated nearly 5 years ago, written in my grandfather's sharp, familiar handwriting. This is the entire record he had written on the first page. For Kendra. When the time comes, use this to tear down the house they built with my money. Do not let them escape. I traced my fingers over his handwriting, feeling a sudden sharp sting of tears in my eyes. He had known. He had known for 5 years that my mother and sister were bleeding him dry. He had known about Andre helping them launder the money through his corporate finance firm. He had sat at family dinners listening to them brag about their luxury vacations and designer clothes, knowing exactly whose money had paid for it all. And he had documented every single stolen cent, waiting for the exact right moment to strike back. Agent Rollins reached into the box and carefully lifted the stack of manila envelopes. These look like bank records, he noted, flipping through the thick files. Wire transfer receipts, offshore account statements, forged power of attorney documents. Your grandfather did not just leave you an inheritance, Kendra. He built an ironclad federal prosecution file. He did all the heavy lifting for us. I picked up the small black flash drive, turning it over in my hand. And what is this? I asked, looking up at Agent Rollins. The agent expression turned grim. Let us go back upstairs to a secure room, he suggested. We need to plug that in and find out exactly what kind of audio he managed to capture. Because if those envelopes contain the paper trail, that flash drive might contain the nail in their coffin. I looked back down into the empty metal box, realizing that the true wealth my grandfather had left me was not just financial. He had left me the power to finally stop the abuse. He had handed me the exact weapon I needed to expose my mother and sister to the world. I gripped the journal tightly in my hand, feeling the cold, heavy metal of the flash drive pressing into my palm. I was ready to listen. We left the cold subterranean vault and rode the private elevator back up to the executive level. Mr. Harrison led us into a secure private conference room at the end of the hall and locked the heavy oak door behind us. This time the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place did not make me panic. It made me feel incredibly safe. We were standing inside a federal war room. Agent Rollins placed the thick stack of manila envelopes on the polished conference table and pulled a secure government laptop from his briefcase. While he booted up his system to process the black flash drive, I sat down in a plush leather chair and opened my grandfather's journal. The leather cover creaked slightly as I turned to the first full entry. The pages were filled with his precise block handwriting. As I read through the dates, a chilling, comprehensive timeline of absolute betrayal began to unfold right in front of my eyes. My grandfather Joseph had known exactly what was happening to his empire for years. The entries detailed how my mother Patricia had slowly started siphoning funds from his secondary business accounts the moment he received his initial terminal diagnosis. But it was not just a few $1,000s missing here and there. According to his meticulous records, she had completely forged his signature on power of attorney documents a full 3 years earlier than she publicly claimed. I turned the thick pages reading paragraphs that made my blood run cold. The journal exposed Andre and his critical role in the massive theft. With his senior position in a ruthless corporate finance firm, Andre had the exact specialized knowledge required to set up a complex web of shell companies. He had opened multiple offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands to hide the stolen real estate assets. My grandfather had somehow managed to record the exact banking routing numbers, the dates, and the exact dollar amounts of every single unauthorized wire transfer Andre had facilitated. And then there was Jasmine. My sister had always claimed she was completely overwhelmed by the emotional stress of our grandfather failing health. She used that excuse to avoid helping me care for him, but the journal painted an entirely different picture of her supposed grief. While I was struggling to pay for his oxygen tanks, Jasmine was simultaneously using those freshly laundered offshore funds to purchase a brand new imported sports car. She bought an entire wardrobe of designer fashion and paid for luxury vacations to Cabo San Lucas. My grandfather had even taped a small jewelry store receipt directly into the journal. It was for the expensive diamond earrings Jasmine had worn to his funeral just yesterday. She had literally bought her mourning jewelry using the money she stole from the dead man she was pretending to cry over. But the most heartbreaking revelation came when I read about his daily life inside that house. I had spent the last 6 months agonizing over his rapidly declining mental state. I truly believed the heavy hospice medications were stealing his brilliant mind, turning him into a confused shadow of the man I loved. I was completely wrong. The journal revealed that he had intentionally exaggerated his confusion. He had been playing the fool on purpose. He pretended to be a senile dying man who could not remember his own name or feed himself just so my mother and Andre would get sloppy around him. He knew that if he confronted them too early with only partial evidence, they would simply destroy the digital records and gaslight him. They would have easily manipulated a judge into placing him under a restrictive psychiatric hold, claiming he was paranoid and unfit to manage his own affairs. So he endured their relentless mockery in silence. He lay in that hospital bed in the center of the living room, listening to them plot his financial ruin over glasses of wine. He silently memorized every single word they said, and then wrote it all down in the dark when they finally went to sleep. He sacrificed his own peace, his dignity, and his comfort in his final months, just to gather undeniable, ironclad evidence against his own flesh and blood. I turned page after page, the tears silently streaming down my face and dripping onto the table. Every single time I had held his hand and cried over his bedside, he had been perfectly lucid. He let me bear the crushing financial burden of his medical care, not because he lacked the funds to pay for it himself. He did it because he knew if he suddenly produced a massive amount of cash to pay the hospice nurses, Patricia would instantly realize he was hiding assets from her. She would have torn the house apart looking for the master passbook. He had to let me go into severe credit card debt to protect the ultimate trap. I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, feeling a profound mixture of grief and fierce admiration for the man. He was a master strategist playing a high-stakes game of chess while my family thought they were playing checkers. He had absorbed every ounce of their toxicity and weaponized it into a perfect federal case. I reached the final pages of the journal. The handwriting here was noticeably different. The ink was lighter, and the letters were slightly less precise, showing the severe physical toll his illness had finally taken on his body. The dates listed corresponded to just a few days before he passed away, right around the time he had quietly slipped me the stained leather passbook and told me to hide it. The bank manager, Mr. Harrison, and Agent Rollins were speaking quietly on the other side of the room, but their voices faded away completely as I stared at the final entry. I wiped another tear from my cheek and read the very last paragraph my grandfather ever wrote. It was not a soft, heartfelt family goodbye. It was a direct military command from a man who had built a massive empire from the dirt and completely refused to let it be stolen by greedy parasites. "I leave the sword to my only honest granddaughter," he wrote, the blue ink pressing so deeply into the thick paper that it almost tore the page. "Cut them down, Kendra." I sat back in the leather chair, the weight of my grandfather. Final words still echoing in my mind. Agent Rollins reached out and gently took the journal from my hands, setting it beside the stack of manila envelopes. His eyes were entirely focused now, entirely clinical. "The paper trail is incredible," he said, tapping the thick files. "But paper can sometimes be contested in court. Lawyers can argue about dates, they can challenge signatures, and they can drag out civil proceedings for years. Audio, however, is a completely different story." He picked up the small black flash drive and inserted it into the secure government laptop. A few seconds later, a folder popped up on the screen. It contained dozens of small MP3 files, each one meticulously labeled by date and time. "Your grandfather hid a digital voice recorder in his home office," Agent Rollins explained, double-clicking the first file. "Let us see what he managed to capture." The audio track opened, and a low hiss of static filled the silent conference room. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of someone breathing heavily. And then my mother's voice came through the laptop speakers. It was crystal clear, completely unguarded, and dripping with the kind of venom I had only ever experienced behind closed doors. "We need to move faster, Andre." My mother's voice snapped, her tone sharp and impatient. "The hospice nurse said his breathing changed this morning. If he dies before we finalize the transfer on the lake house, the estate goes into probate. We cannot afford to have a court-appointed executor poking around the offshore accounts." I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the mahogany table. The recording was dated exactly 3 weeks ago. It was the same week I had begged my mother to help me cover the cost of a new oxygen machine because my credit cards were completely maxed out. She had told me she was broke. "Do not panic, Patricia Andre," deep voice replied, sounding incredibly calm and arrogant. "I have the new warranty deed right here. The buyer is a shell company I set up last month. We just need the old man's signature on the bottom line, and the transfer will be completely untraceable." "How are we going to get him to sign it?" my mother asked, her voice filled with nervous agitation. "He barely knows what day it is. Yesterday, he thought Kendra was his late wife. If we try to make him hold a pen, the signature will look like a child's scribble. The county clerk will flag it instantly." "We do not need him to hold the pen," Andre said, chuckling softly. "That is the beauty of it. You have been practicing his signature for 5 years, Patricia. You can forge it better than he can actually write it at this point. Just sign the damn paper yourself. I will backdate the notary stamp using my firm's seal. It will look completely legitimate." A heavy silence followed on the recording. I could almost picture my mother sitting at my grandfather's massive oak desk, holding his favorite fountain pen. "What about Kendra?" my mother asked suddenly, her voice lowering. "She is here every single day. If she finds out we sold the lake house, she will lose her mind. She thinks he is going to leave it to her because of all those summers they spent fishing together." Andre laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that made my stomach turn. Let the teacher lose her mind. What is she going to do about it? Hire a lawyer with her empty bank account. By the time she realizes the lake house is gone, she will be so drowning in medical debt, she will be begging us for a loan just to keep her apartment. We will throw her a few $1,000s from the estate to keep her quiet. She is weak, Patricia. She will take whatever scraps we give her. The recording clicked off. The conference room was completely silent again, save for the low hum of the air conditioning unit. I stared at the black laptop screen, feeling a cold, hard knot form in the center of my chest. They had literally laughed about my financial ruin. They had planned to use the massive debt I incurred caring for him as a weapon to force me into silence. Agent Rollins closed the laptop, folding his hands carefully on top of the device. He looked across the table at me, his expression unreadable. "I have listened to a lot of wiretaps in my career, Kendra," he said quietly. "I have heard cartel bosses and corporate embezzlers discuss incredibly dark things, but the sheer casual cruelty your family displays is honestly breathtaking." I did not know what to say. The anger I felt was so immense, so entirely overwhelming, that it bypassed rage and settled into a pure, sharp focus. I had spent 35 years trying to prove to my mother that I was worthy of her love. I had chased her approval like a desperate child, completely blind to the fact that she was a predator who only viewed me as prey. "We have the evidence we need to build a massive federal case," Agent Rollins continued, leaning forward. "We can easily prove wire fraud, forgery, and elder financial abuse. But right now, we only have them discussing the crime. To guarantee maximum sentencing, without a shadow of a doubt, we need to catch them in the absolute act of executing the final fraudulent will." I looked up at him, my mind instantly calculating the next steps. "How do we do that?" I asked. Agent Rollins pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. "You said they were panicked yesterday in the hallway outside your apartment. They know the offshore accounts are frozen, and they know you took the master ledger to the bank. They are backed into a corner, Kendra. And when greedy people get backed into a corner, they always try to double down and secure whatever physical assets they can still reach." He slid his phone across the table. It displayed a text message interface. "I need you to provoke them," he explained. "I need you to make them believe that they have completely won. We need Patricia to publicly present the forged will she created, naming Jasmine as the sole heir. Once she formally attempts to execute that document in front of witnesses, the federal trap snaps shut permanently." I picked up the phone, looking at the blank text message screen. "Provoke them how I asked. Tell them you are backing off," Agent Rollins instructed. "Tell them you are terrified of Andre legal threats and that you want to apologize for taking the passbook to the bank. Tell them you just want the nightmare to end, and you are willing to accept whatever small inheritance they offer if they promise not to ruin your teaching career." It went against every single instinct in my body to submit to them again. I wanted to scream in my mother's face. I wanted to drag Andre out into the street and expose him to everyone. But my grandfather had played the long game. He had endured their abuse for years just to build this perfect trap. I could endure it for a few more days to ensure they never saw the light of day again. I typed out the message exactly as Agent Rollins suggested, my fingers flying across the digital keyboard. I hit send and set the phone back down on the table. We waited in silence for less than 3 minutes before the screen lit up with a reply from my mother. The message was brief and incredibly arrogant. "I am glad you finally came to your senses, Kendra. We are holding a formal family dinner tomorrow night at Le Petit Palais to officially read your grandfather will. Do not be late, and wear something presentable this time." I read the message out loud, my voice steady and completely void of emotion. Le Petit Palais was one of the most expensive and exclusive restaurants in the city. My mother was planning to use the reading of the forged will as a massive social event to show off her new wealth to the extended family. It was the perfect stage for her ultimate triumph. Agent Rollins smiled a slow, predatory smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "Perfect," he said softly, tapping his finger against the laptop. "Tomorrow night, Patricia is going to stand up in front of everyone she knows and proudly confess to a federal crime, and we are going to let her." He looked at me, his gaze intense. "But we need you to be the one to light the match, Kendra. Are you willing to wear a wire to that dinner?" I thought about my grandfather lying in that hospital bed listening to them plot his ruin. I thought about the ruined black dress sitting in the trash bin under my sink. I thought about the 35 years of insults, manipulation, and gaslighting I had endured. I looked Agent Rollins straight in the eye. "I am not just going to wear a wire," I said, my voice cold and absolute. "I am going to burn their entire house down." I sat back in the leather chair, the weight of my grandfather's final words still echoing in my mind. Agent Rollins reached out and gently took the journal from my hands, setting it beside the stack of manila envelopes. His eyes were entirely focused now, entirely clinical. "The paper trail is incredible," he said, tapping the thick files. "But paper can sometimes be contested in court. Lawyers can argue about dates, they can challenge signatures, and they can drag out civil proceedings for years. Audio, however, is a completely different story." He picked up the small black flash drive and inserted it into the secure government laptop. A few seconds later, a folder popped up on the screen. It contained dozens of small MP3 files, each one meticulously labeled by date and time. "Your grandfather hid a digital voice recorder in his home office," Agent Rollins explained, double-clicking the first file. "Let us see what he managed to capture." The audio track opened, and a low hiss of static filled the silent conference room. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of someone breathing heavily. And then my mother's voice came through the laptop speakers. It was crystal clear, completely unguarded, and dripping with the kind of venom I had only ever experienced behind closed doors. "We need to move faster." "Andre," my mother's voice snapped, her tone sharp and impatient. "The hospice nurse said his breathing changed this morning. If he dies before we finalize the transfer on the lake house, the estate goes into probate. We cannot afford to have a court-appointed executor poking around the offshore accounts." I leaned forward, gripping the edge of the mahogany table. The recording was dated exactly 3 weeks ago. It was the same week I had begged my mother to help me cover the cost of a new oxygen machine because my credit cards were completely maxed out. She had told me she was broke. "Do not panic." Patricia Andre, deep voice replied, sounding incredibly calm and arrogant. "I have the new warranty deed right here. The buyer is a shell company I set up last month. We just need the old man's signature on the bottom line, and the transfer will be completely untraceable." "How are we going to get him to sign it?" my mother asked, her voice filled with nervous agitation. "He barely knows what day it is. Yesterday he thought Kendra was his late wife. If we try to make him hold a pen, the signature will look like a child scribble. The county clerk will flag it instantly." "We do not need him to hold the pen," Andre said, chuckling softly. "That is the beauty of it. You have been practicing his signature for 5 years, Patricia. You can forge it better than he can actually write it at this point. Just sign the damn paper yourself. I will backdate the notary stamp using my firm's seal. It will look completely legitimate." A heavy silence followed on the recording. I could almost picture my mother sitting at my grandfather's massive oak desk, holding his favorite fountain pen. "What about Kendra?" my mother asked suddenly, her voice lowering. "She is here every single day. If she finds out we sold the lake house, she will lose her mind. She thinks he is going to leave it to her because of all those summers they spent fishing together." Andre laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that made my stomach turn. "Let the teacher lose her mind. What is she going to do about it? Hire a lawyer with her empty bank account. By the time she realizes the lake house is gone, she will be so drowning in medical debt, she will be begging us for a loan just to keep her apartment. We will throw her a few $1,000s from the estate to keep her quiet. She is weak, Patricia. She will take whatever scraps we give her." The recording clicked off. The conference room was completely silent again, save for the low hum of the air conditioning unit. I stared at the black laptop screen, feeling a cold, hard knot form in the center of my chest. They had literally laughed about my financial ruin. They had planned to use the massive debt I incurred caring for him as a weapon to force me into silence. Agent Rollins closed the laptop, folding his hands carefully on top of the device. He looked across the table at me, his expression unreadable. "I have listened to a lot of wiretaps in my career, Kendra," he said quietly. "I have heard cartel bosses and corporate embezzlers discuss incredibly dark things. But the sheer casual cruelty your family displays is honestly breathtaking." I did not know what to say. The anger I felt was so immense, so entirely overwhelming, that it bypassed rage and settled into a pure, sharp focus. I had spent 35 years trying to prove to my mother that I was worthy of her love. I had chased her approval like a desperate child, completely blind to the fact that she was a predator who only viewed me as prey. "We have the evidence we need to build a massive federal case," Agent Rollins continued, leaning forward. "We can easily prove wire fraud, forgery, and elder financial abuse. But right now, we only have them discussing the crime. To guarantee maximum sentencing, without a shadow of a doubt, we need to catch them in the absolute act of executing the final fraudulent will." I looked up at him, my mind instantly calculating the next steps. "How do we do that?" I asked. Agent Rollins pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. "You said they were panicked yesterday in the hallway outside your apartment. They know the offshore accounts are frozen, and they know you took the master ledger to the bank. They are backed into a corner, Kendra. And when greedy people get backed into a corner, they always try to double down and secure whatever physical assets they can still reach." He slid his phone across the table. It displayed a text message interface. "I need you to provoke them," he explained. "I need you to make them believe that they have completely won. We need Patricia to publicly present the forged will she created, naming Jasmine as the sole heir. Once she formally attempts to execute that document in front of witnesses, the federal trap snaps shut permanently." I picked up the phone, looking at the blank text message screen. "Provoke them how I asked. Tell them you are backing off," Agent Rollins instructed. "Tell them you are terrified of Andre legal threats and that you want to apologize for taking the passbook to the bank. Tell them you just want the nightmare to end, and you are willing to accept whatever small inheritance they offer if they promise not to ruin your teaching career." It went against every single instinct in my body to submit to them again. I wanted to scream in my mother's face. I wanted to drag Andre out into the street and expose him to everyone. But my grandfather had played the long game. He had endured their abuse for years, just to build this perfect trap. I could endure it for a few more days to ensure they never saw the light of day again. I typed out the message exactly as Agent Rollins suggested, my fingers flying across the digital keyboard. I hit send and set the phone back down on the table. Agent Rollins nodded slowly, a look of profound respect crossing his features. I had just agreed to wear a federal wire to take down my own flesh and blood. But before Agent Rollins could open his briefcase to begin discussing the tactical logistics of the sting operation, Mr. Harrison cleared his throat. The bank manager reached over to the long, heavy metal safety deposit box, still sitting on the edge of the polished mahogany conference table. "We are not quite finished, Ms. Joseph," Mr. Harrison said, his voice carrying a sudden formal weight. "There is one more item at the very bottom of the box." He reached inside and carefully lifted a thin, false-bottom panel that both Agent Rollins and I had completely overlooked beneath the stack of manila envelopes. Underneath the metal plate lay a thick, heavy ivory envelope. It was unlike any standard legal document I had ever seen. It was bound in thick woven twine and sealed with a heavy pool of dark red wax. Pressed into the center of the wax was the intricate embossed crest of a top-tier independent corporate law firm based out of Chicago. It was a firm located hundreds of miles away from Atlanta, completely outside the sphere of my mother's local real estate connections. "Your grandfather was a brilliant strategist," Mr. Harrison explained carefully, lifting the envelope and passing it across the table to me. He knew that Patricia had spent years cultivating relationships with local county clerks and small-town attorneys. He knew that if he used his regular local lawyer to draft his final wishes, Patricia would find out about it before the ink was even dry. She would have used her power of attorney to contest it immediately. so he quietly retained one of the most ruthless and expensive corporate law firms in the country to handle his actual estate planning. I stared down at the heavy envelope resting in my hands. The dark red wax felt cool and permanent against my skin. "Go ahead," Mr. Harrison urged softly. "You are the only one legally authorized to break the seal." I slid my thumb under the edge of the hardened wax and pushed upward. The seal snapped with a sharp, satisfying crack echoing in the quiet room. I unwound the twine and pulled out a thick stack of crisp, watermarked legal paper. The heading at the top was printed in bold, elegant typography. It read, "The Last Will and Testament of Joseph Thomas." I began to read the dense legal text, my eyes scanning the intricately structured paragraphs. The first few pages outlined his formal declarations, confirming that he was of sound mind and acting entirely under his own free will. He explicitly and legally revoked any and all previous wills, testaments, and power of attorney documents, including the ones my mother was currently using to drain his accounts. But it was the asset distribution section that completely took my breath away. For my entire life, my mother had controlled the narrative of our family wealth. She flaunted her expensive cars and her massive house, acting as if she was the sole heir to a modest but comfortable local real estate business. I had always assumed my grandfather was wealthy, but I had no idea of the true, staggering magnitude of the empire he had built from nothing. The document listed a massive commercial real estate portfolio. He did not just own the lake house and a few local rental properties. He owned entire high-traffic strip malls in the metropolitan area. He held the deeds to 3 towering luxury apartment complexes downtown. He owned acres of undeveloped commercial zoning land on the edge of the city. The portfolio was worth tens of millions of dollars. And he had quietly consolidated every single asset into a private holding company. I read the next paragraph out loud, my voice trembling slightly as the words blurred before my eyes. "I hereby leave 100% of the voting shares, assets, and properties of my holding company to my granddaughter Kendra. She is to assume immediate and total control of the entire portfolio upon my death." I stopped reading, completely paralyzed by shock. I looked up at Mr. Harrison and Agent Rollins. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear the rushing sound of blood in my ears. "He left it all to me," I whispered, the reality of the document feeling entirely too immense to comprehend. "Every single building, every single account. He left me the entire empire." "Keep reading." Kendra, Agent Rollins encouraged, a small knowing smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Look at the next clause." I looked back down at the crisp paper. Beneath the transfer of the holding company was a section detailing a private liquid trust fund. My grandfather had set aside a massive sum of untouchable cash specifically designed to clear any debts I had incurred during his illness. He wanted to ensure that I would never have to worry about my rent, my credit cards, or my teacher's salary ever again. He had mathematically calculated my freedom. And then I reached the final section of the asset distribution. It was dedicated to my mother and my sister. "I have watched the greed and moral decay of my daughter Patricia and my granddaughter Jasmine with profound disappointment," the will read. "They have chosen a life of superficial vanity, built entirely upon deception and the exploitation of my failing health. To ensure that this document cannot be legally contested on the grounds that I simply forgot to include my remaining family members, I leave Patricia and Jasmine the sum of exactly $1 each. This is not an oversight. It is a precise reflection of their exact worth to my legacy." I let out a breath I did not even realize I was holding. A single dollar. It was the ultimate, irrefutable insult from beyond the grave. My grandfather had not just cut them out of his fortune. He had permanently, legally documented their absolute worthlessness to the family name. They had spent 5 years stealing from a dying man, risking federal prison to siphon off a few $1 million, when they could have simply been decent human beings and inherited an empire. Their own toxic greed had literally cost them generational wealth. "This document is your absolute shield," Agent Rollins explained, leaning forward and tapping the heavy paper. Patricia is currently walking around believing she has successfully forged a will that names Jasmine as the sole heir. She thinks she has completely won. When she presents her forged document tomorrow, she will be committing a massive felony in front of a room full of witnesses. And when she is finished, you are going to drop this authentic top-tier legal document right on the table. It is going to completely obliterate her entire reality. I carefully folded the thick watermarked pages and slid them back into the ivory envelope. I had walked into this bank exhausted, terrified, and deeply in debt. I was leaving as the sole owner of a massive commercial real estate empire, armed with the exact evidence needed to send my abusers to federal prison. The heavy, crushing weight of anxiety that I had carried on my shoulders for 35 years was completely gone. In its place was a cold, sharp determination. Suddenly, the silence of the secure conference room was broken by a sharp, vibrating sound. My phone was buzzing violently inside my purse. I reached in and pulled it out, looking down at the brightly illuminated screen. It was a text message from my mother, Patricia, responding to the message I had sent just minutes earlier. I swiped the screen to open the message, reading the cold, demanding words she had just typed. Family dinner tomorrow at Le Petit Palais. For the official reading of Grandpa, will it read, "Do not be late. Do not." I looked up from the brightly illuminated screen of my phone and met Agent Rollins' steady gaze. I read the text message out loud so both he and Mr. Harrison could hear the arrogant certainty in my mother's words. Family dinner tomorrow at Le Petit Palais for the official reading of Grandpa Will. Do not be late. Agent Rollins leaned back in his chair, a look of deep, professional satisfaction crossing his face. She is moving even faster than I anticipated, he said, pulling a small notepad from his suit pocket. She wants to establish dominance and solidify her narrative in front of the extended family before the bank can formally process what she thinks is just a simple freeze on the accounts. This dinner is our golden opportunity, Kendra, but it requires you to walk directly into the lion den. I set my phone down on the polished mahogany table. Tell me exactly what you need me to do, I said. We need to capture her establishing criminal intent. Agent Rollins explained, his voice dropping into a serious tactical register. Right now we have audio of her discussing the forgery, but tomorrow night she will actually present the fraudulent document. To make the federal charges stick with absolute certainty, we need her to verbally claim the forged will is authentic in front of multiple witnesses, and we need to record every single second of that presentation. He leaned forward, resting his arms on the table. I need you to wear a concealed wire to this dinner, Kendra. We will have federal agents positioned inside the restaurant, posing as regular diners and staff. We will be monitoring the audio feed in real time from a surveillance van parked down the street. The moment she finishes reading the forged will, and you present the authentic document, we will move in and make the arrests. But until that exact moment, you will be entirely on your own at that table. Agent Rollins studied my face carefully, searching for any sign of hesitation. I need to be completely honest with you, he continued. This means you have to sit there and let them verbally abuse you one last time. You have to play the defeated, broken victim. You cannot show your hand until she has completely committed to the crime. Can you do that? Can you stomach sitting across from them and playing the scapegoat for one more night? I looked down at the heavy ivory envelope resting on the table containing the real will that legally granted me my grandfather's entire empire. I thought about the question Agent Rollins had just asked. Could I stomach playing the victim for one more night? I almost laughed at the bitter irony of it. I had 35 years of relentless, uninterrupted practice. For my entire life, I had existed as the designated emotional dumping ground for my family narcissistic dynamic. My mind drifted back through decades of calculated cruelty. I remembered my 16th birthday. My mother had thrown a massive, lavish party for Jasmine, who was only 13 at the time, just because she had won a minor local beauty pageant. When I quietly asked about my birthday dinner, Patricia handed me a $20 bill and told me they had forgotten to order a cake, so I should just go buy myself a pizza. I remembered the day I graduated with my master's degree in education. I was the first person in our family to actually earn a postgraduate degree without buying my way into a program. Instead of congratulating me, Andre had stood in my small apartment, looked at my framed diploma, and joked to Jasmine that maybe now I could finally afford to buy name-brand cereal instead of the cheap generic bags. They had laughed until they cried while I stood there swallowing the humiliation. And then there was the endless suffocating gaslighting. Every time I tried to set a boundary or express hurt over their treatment, the narrative was instantly flipped. If I complained, I was told I was too sensitive. If I cried, I was called emotionally unstable. If I pointed out the blatant favoritism Patricia showered on Jasmine, I was labeled jealous and bitter. They had spent 3.5 decades meticulously convincing me that my pain was my own fault. They needed me to be weak and broken so they could feel powerful and superior. Yes, I said, my voice completely steady, pulling myself out of the memories and looking directly at Agent Rollins. I can play the part. I will give them the exact performance they are expecting. The next 24 hours moved with a strange, hyper-focused clarity. I left the bank with the authentic will safely secured in a heavy leather portfolio and drove back to my apartment. I did not sleep that night. I sat on my worn sofa, staring at the blank television screen, running through every possible scenario in my mind. I was not nervous. The anxiety that usually paralyzed my chest whenever I had to face my mother was completely gone. It had been entirely burned away, replaced by a cold, mechanical determination. Late the next afternoon, there was a quiet knock at my apartment door. It was a female FBI technician, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater, carrying a nondescript black duffel bag. She stepped inside and quickly locked the door behind her. "Agent Rollins sent me," she said, introducing herself with a quick professional smile. "I am here to get you fitted for the dinner." I led her into my small bathroom where she opened the duffel bag and pulled out a complex array of thin wires and a small flat battery pack. The recording device was incredibly sophisticated. It was not a bulky microphone like you see in old police movies. It was a tiny flat sensor that she carefully taped directly to the center of my sternum using medical-grade adhesive. She ran the microscopic wire over my shoulder and secured the battery pack flat against the curve of my lower back, where it would be completely invisible under clothing. She handed me an earpiece that was so small it sat deep inside my ear canal, completely hidden by my hair. "We will not talk to you unless it is an absolute emergency," she explained, testing the audio levels on a handheld receiver. "But if things go sideways, or if Andre becomes physically aggressive, Agent Rollins will give you the signal to step away from the table. You just focus on letting Patricia do the talking. We hear you loud and clear." The technician packed up her bag and left, wishing me luck. I stood alone in my quiet apartment, listening to the faint hum of the city traffic outside my window. It was time to get dressed. I walked into my bedroom and opened my small closet. I bypassed the plain beige sweaters, the sensible slacks, and the modest dresses I usually wore to blend into the background. Instead, I reached all the way to the back and pulled out a plastic dry cleaning bag. Inside the bag was the black funeral dress. It was the exact same dress I had worn to my grandfather repast 2 days ago. The exact same dress Jasmine had deliberately ruined by violently shoving her shoulder into my chest and spilling her heavy goblet of red wine all over me. I had initially thrown it into the kitchen trash bin, wanting to be rid of the humiliating memory. But early yesterday morning, before I went to the bank to meet with the FBI, I had pulled it out and rushed it to an emergency dry cleaner down the street, paying extra for immediate stain removal. I unzipped the plastic bag and pulled the dress out. The dry cleaner had worked a genuine miracle. The dark crimson stains were completely gone, leaving the fabric pristine and sharp. I slipped the dress over my head, smoothing the fabric down over my hips. It fit perfectly, covering the wire taped to my chest without showing a single ridge or outline. I walked over to the full-length mirror on the back of my bedroom door and stared at my reflection. I did not look like the family scapegoat anymore. I did not look like the exhausted broke teacher who had spent the last 6 months being emotionally battered by narcissists. The woman looking back at me had cold eyes and a perfectly straight spine. Wearing this specific dress was a calculated silent message. When Jasmine and Patricia saw me wearing it, they would instantly assume I was too poor to buy anything else. They would look at the dress and feel a surge of smug superiority, believing they had completely broken my spirit. They would think I was returning to them with my head bowed, ready to accept whatever pathetic scraps they decided to throw my way. "Let them think I am weak," I whispered to my reflection. My voice picked up perfectly by the hidden federal microphone resting against my chest. "Let them think they have won." I picked up my purse, making sure the heavy leather portfolio containing my grandfather's true legacy was safely tucked inside. I grabbed my car keys and walked out of the apartment, locking the door behind me. I was not going to a family dinner. I was walking onto a battlefield, and I was ready for war. I pulled my beat-up sedan up to the valet stand at Le Petit Palais, feeling the immediate contrast between my life and the world my mother was trying to claim. The restaurant was a fortress of culinary exclusivity, located in the wealthiest district of the city. The exterior was draped in lush ivy and illuminated by soft gas lanterns. I handed my keys to the valet, who gave my aging car a brief dismissive look before driving it away. I took a deep breath, feeling the slight pull of the medical tape against my sternum. The hidden microphone was secure. I smoothed down the fabric of my pristine black funeral dress and walked through the heavy brass front doors. The maitre d' led me through the crowded main dining room, which was buzzing with the low hum of expensive conversations and the clinking of fine crystal. We bypassed the regular patrons and approached a set of heavy mahogany doors at the very back of the restaurant. He opened them smoothly, revealing a private dining room that was absolutely dripping in opulence. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the center of the vaulted ceiling, casting a warm golden glow over a long, polished mahogany table. Centerpieces of white orchids and roses ran down the middle of the table, surrounded by silver candelabras and gold-rimmed bone china. Almost the entire extended family was already there. I saw my aunts, uncles, and a few older cousins mingling near the private bar, holding expensive cocktails. My mother, Patricia, was holding court at the head of the room, wearing a tailored emerald green evening gown that undoubtedly cost several months of my teaching salary. Jasmine was standing next to her, draped in a stunning silk cocktail dress, sparkling with new diamond jewelry. Andre stood close by, holding a glass of dark liquor, looking like the quintessential corporate finance kingmaker. The moment I stepped into the room, the conversations noticeably dropped in volume. Dozens of eyes turned to look at me. I could instantly read their silent judgments. They saw the simple black dress I was wearing. They recognized it from the funeral repast. I saw my aunt whisper something behind her hand to my cousin. In their eyes, I was exactly what my mother wanted them to see. I was the broke, exhausted public school teacher who could not even afford a new outfit for a formal family dinner. I kept my head down, perfectly playing the role of the defeated scapegoat. I walked over to the far end of the table, taking a seat as far away from the head of the family as possible. My mother noticed my arrival and offered a tight, patronizing smile from across the room. She did not walk over to greet me. She simply turned back to her guests, soaking up the attention and the premature congratulations on her impending wealth. I sat quietly watching the room. I noticed a young waiter standing near the corner, pouring water into crystal goblets. He had a tight military haircut and an intense, focused gaze that did not quite match the subservient posture of a restaurant server. When he briefly made eye contact with me, he gave the absolute slightest imperceptible nod. Agent Rollins had kept his promise. The federal trap was set, and the FBI was in the room. Dinner was served over the next 2 hours. It was a lavish, multi-course affair, featuring imported caviar butter, poached lobster, and expensive cuts of Wagyu beef. I barely touched my food, pushing the rich ingredients around my plate. The extended family members seated near me made awkward, polite small talk, occasionally offering me looks of deep pity. They asked how I was holding up with my credit card debt and if I needed help finding a second job for the summer. The gaslighting and the rumors had clearly spread fast. My mother had already painted the narrative that I had recklessly bankrupted myself while she and Jasmine had supposedly done everything they could to save our grandfather. I swallowed my anger and gave them exactly what they expected. I spoke softly, kept my eyes lowered, and agreed that things were very difficult right now. Every time I acted weak, I could see Andre smirking from the other end of the table. My submission was giving them the ultimate confidence they needed to spring their trap. Finally, the waiters cleared the dessert plates and poured fresh champagne into everyone's flutes. The room grew warm and comfortable. It was the exact perfect environment for a narcissist to take center stage. Patricia stood up from her chair at the head of the table. She picked up a silver dessert spoon and gently tapped it against her crystal champagne flute. The sharp ringing sound cut through the low chatter, immediately silencing the room. Everyone turned their attention to her. Patricia took a deep, trembling breath, perfectly manufacturing the image of a grieving, devoted daughter. She dabbed at the corner of her dry eye with a cloth napkin, before looking out at the gathered family members. "Thank you all for being here tonight," she began, her voice carrying a delicate, practiced quiver. "This has been an incredibly difficult week for our family. Losing my father has left a massive hole in my heart. But knowing that we are all gathered here together supporting one another gives me the strength to carry out his final wishes." She reached down and picked up a sleek black leather legal folder that had been resting on the chair next to her. She held it with both hands as if it were a sacred religious text. "Before my father passed away, he entrusted me with a very heavy responsibility." Patricia continued, her voice growing stronger, more authoritative. "He wanted to make sure his legacy was protected. He wanted to ensure that the commercial real estate business he built from the ground up would continue to thrive and provide for the family in the most responsible way possible. To that end, he had his lawyers draft his final will and testament, and he asked me to share it with all of you tonight." The room was dead silent. I sat at the far end of the table, my hands resting calmly in my lap, listening to her verbally walk right into a federal felony. Patricia opened the leather folder and pulled out a few sheets of thick paper. The document looked incredibly official, complete with a heavy gold notary seal at the bottom. I knew that Andre had provided that seal using his corporate finance connections to backdate the forgery and make it look completely legitimate. "I will spare you all the dense legal jargon," Patricia said, offering a sad, gentle smile to the room. "But the directives are very clear. My father has appointed me as the sole executor of his entire estate, granting me absolute authority over all liquid assets and property transfers." A murmur of approval went around the table. The older relatives nodded, believing this was the natural order of things. Furthermore, Patricia continued, her eyes briefly darting toward Jasmine, who was practically glowing with anticipation. "Recognizing the heavy burden of managing commercial properties and acknowledging who has the true business acumen in this family, my father has left the entirety of his real estate portfolio and his corporate holdings to his youngest granddaughter, Jasmine." Gasps of surprise and scattered applause broke out among the extended family. Jasmine covered her mouth, feigning shock as Andre wrapped a proud, protective arm around her waist. They looked like the perfect, successful couple inheriting their rightful kingdom. I sat perfectly still. I did not gasp. I did not cry. I just watched my mother. Patricia raised her hand to quiet the room again. She turned her gaze slowly down the length of the long mahogany table until her eyes locked directly onto mine. The fake warmth completely vanished from her face, replaced by a look of absolute cold triumph. She had won. She had publicly established her dominance, and she was about to deliver the final humiliating blow to ensure I stayed broken forever. "Kendra, sweetheart." Patricia said, her voice dripping with a sickly sweet, patronizing tone that made my skin crawl. "I know this must be very hard for you to hear. Your grandfather loved you very much, but he was also a very practical man. He knew how much you struggle with your finances. He knew that burdening a public school teacher with millions of dollars in commercial property taxes and corporate liabilities would simply destroy you. He wanted to protect you from yourself. She reached her perfectly manicured hand into the inside pocket of the leather folder and pulled out a small, crisp, rectangular slip of paper. But he did not forget about the sacrifices you made during those final few weeks, Patricia cooed, stepping slightly away from her chair. He wanted to make sure you were compensated for your time playing nurse. She placed the slip of paper flat on the polished mahogany wood. With a smooth, deliberate motion, she placed her index finger on top of it and slid it hard across the long table. The piece of paper glided over the smooth wood, passing the floral centerpieces and the crystal glasses until it came to a complete stop exactly 1 inch away from my hands. I looked down at it. It was a cashier check drawn from one of the estate's secondary accounts. It was made out to me. Patricia smiled, her eyes gleaming with toxic satisfaction. "For your trouble, sweetie," she said, her voice echoing perfectly in the quiet room for the hidden microphone to capture. $5,000. It is what your grandfather would have wanted to help with your little credit card debts. I stared at the $5,000 check resting on the polished mahogany. The entire room was holding its collective breath, waiting for the familiar script to play out. They expected me to burst into tears, grab the check, and run out of the restaurant in a cloud of humiliation. Patricia stood at the head of the table, her emerald green gown shimmering under the crystal chandelier, wearing a smile of absolute toxic victory. Jasmine was literally holding her breath, her eyes wide with eager anticipation. I did not yell. I did not cry. I did not even blink. I slowly raised my hand, placed my index finger on the center of the crisp paper, and deliberately pushed it right back across the table. "You can keep it, Patricia," I said, my voice completely devoid of the tremor they were all waiting to hear. "I think you are going to need it to pay for your legal defense." The smug smile on my mother's face faltered slightly. A murmur of confusion rippled through the seated relatives. I reached into my small black purse and pulled out my smartphone. When I first sat down, I had noticed the private dining room was equipped with a high-end wireless surround sound system built into the vaulted ceiling. It took me exactly 4 seconds to open my settings menu and pair my device to the open network. "What are you doing?" Andre demanded, his deep voice cutting through the rising whispers. "Put your phone away, Kendra. Stop embarrassing yourself." I ignored him completely. I opened the audio file Agent Rollins had specifically prepared and isolated for me. I turned the media volume on my phone all the way up and pressed play. The high-fidelity speakers mounted in the corners of the dining room crackled to life. For a split second, there was only the sound of heavy breathing. Then a voice boomed from the ceiling. It was not the weak, raspy whisper of a dying man. It was the sharp, authoritative baritone of my grandfather Joseph in his prime confronting his daughter. "I know exactly what you are doing, Patricia." His recorded voice thundered, echoing off the mahogany walls. "Do not stand there and lie to my face. I have seen the offshore routing numbers. I know you and Andre have been forging my signature to drain the commercial accounts. I have tracked every single cent you stole." The color instantly drained from my mother's face. She looked like she had just been struck by lightning. She grabbed the edge of the table, her knuckles turning completely white. Several of my older aunts gasped out loud, covering their mouths in absolute horror. Then the recording played Patricia's response. Her voice was cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of remorse. "So what if I did, Dad?" she hissed on the tape. "You are dying anyway. You cannot take the buildings with you. Jasmine and I deserve this money now. Nobody is going to believe a senile old man over his own daughter who holds his power of attorney. We have already moved the funds. There is nothing you can do about it." The silence in the private dining room was shattered by a chorus of shocked exclamations. My Uncle George stood up so fast his heavy wooden chair crashed backward onto the carpet. Jasmine let out a high-pitched shriek, dropping her crystal champagne flute. It shattered against the floor, spraying expensive sparkling wine over her designer shoes. She frantically grabbed Andre's arm, but Andre was not looking at her. He was staring directly at me, his eyes wide with the terrifying realization that his entire corporate career and freedom were evaporating in real time. "Turn that off!" Patricia screamed, her voice cracking with pure panic. "Turn it off right now!" She lunged forward, trying to snatch the phone from my hand, but she was too far away at the head of the long table. The recording continued to play, detailing their exact plans to launder the stolen funds through Andre Finance firm. Every single word was a nail in their coffin, broadcasted in high definition to everyone they had invited to witness their fake triumph. Andre's face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The polished, sophisticated finance executive completely vanished, replaced by a cornered, desperate animal. He knew that recording was not just embarrassing family drama. It was a direct admission of massive federal wire fraud and elder abuse. He knew exactly what it meant if that audio left this room. "Give me the phone, you stupid woman!" Andre roared, his voice booming over the sound of the recording. Without a second thought, he threw himself onto the top of the mahogany dining table. He scrambled across the polished wood, completely ignoring the lavish spread. His knees crushed the expensive floral centerpieces. His heavy dress shoes kicked over silver candelabras and smashed crystal water goblets, sending shards of glass and freezing water flying into the laps of the terrified relatives. I sat perfectly still, my hand gripping the phone as he closed the distance between us in seconds. His eyes were wild, his teeth bared in a furious snarl. He reached out with a massive hand, fingers curled into claws, desperate to snatch the device from my grip and destroy the evidence. I did not flinch, and I did not pull away. I just stared right into his panicked eyes, knowing that the microphone taped to my chest was capturing every single second of his violent assault. Andre was suspended in the air, his expensive suit completely ruined by the food and wine he was crushing beneath his knees. His hands were just inches away from my face, his fingers grasping desperately for my phone. But before he could even brush my skin, the heavy solid oak doors of the private dining room burst open with a deafening crash that shook the walls. A flood of federal agents wearing dark tactical gear over their dress shirts swarmed into the room. "Federal Bureau of Investigation, nobody move!" A commanding voice shouted over the chaos. It was Agent Rollins. He stepped into the room with his gold badge held high, his eyes scanning the absolute disaster of the dining table. Two massive federal agents bypassed him, completely rushing straight for the table. They grabbed Andre by the shoulders mid-lunge and slammed him face first right into a silver platter of mashed potatoes and imported caviar. Andre let out a muffled shriek of pain and shock as the agents pinned his arms forcefully behind his back, snapping a pair of heavy metal handcuffs around his wrists. The entire extended family erupted into absolute panic. My aunts and uncles scrambled backward, pressing themselves against the mahogany walls, trying to get as far away from the table as possible. Jasmine let out a piercing, hysterical scream, covering her face with her hands as a female federal agent approached her. Patricia was completely frozen. She stood at the head of the table, her mouth hanging open in silent disbelief, her emerald green evening gown looking completely ridiculous amidst the sudden violent reality of a federal raid. Agent Rollins walked slowly down the length of the table, his shoes crunching on the shattered crystal. He stopped right in front of my mother. "Patricia Thomas," he said, his voice loud and authoritative, easily cutting through the panicked murmurs of the room. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, wire fraud, forgery, and the financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." My mother finally found her voice. Her face flushed a dark, angry red, and she puffed out her chest, attempting to use her local real estate status to intimidate a federal agent. "This is a massive mistake," she stammered, pointing a shaking finger at him. "Do you know who I am? I am the executor of this estate. My father just died. You cannot burst into a private family dinner and treat me like a criminal. I want my lawyer right now." Agent Rollins offered her a cold, thoroughly unimpressed smile. "Your local lawyer cannot help you, Patricia," he replied calmly. "We have been tracking your offshore wire transfers for 8 months. We have the master passbook you threw in the trash yesterday. And thanks to the wireless speakers in this room, we also have 20 witnesses who just heard you directly confess to forging your father's signature to steal a commercial real estate empire. As the female agent forced Jasmine's hands behind her back to cuff her, my sister began to sob uncontrollably. Her knees buckled and she nearly collapsed onto the carpet, her expensive diamond earrings swinging wildly. She looked toward the table, searching for her husband to save her. But Andre was not coming to save anyone. The arrogant, confident corporate finance kingmaker had completely vanished. Pinned against the ruined table with caviar smeared across his cheek, Andre realized with absolute terrifying clarity that his entire life was over. His lucrative career, his social status, his freedom, it was all gone. And in that moment of ultimate pressure, the man who had mocked me for being a weak public school teacher completely folded. Tears began to stream down Andre's face, mixing with the food on his skin. He started to hyperventilate, gasping for air as he looked up at the agents holding him down. "It was not my idea," Andre screamed, his voice cracking in a pathetic, desperate wail. "I did not want to do it. It was them." He violently jerked his head toward Jasmine and Patricia, pointing his chin because his hands were bound. "They made me do it. Jasmine was constantly spending money. She threatened to leave me if I did not help them access the accounts. Patricia forged the documents. I just moved the money. I will testify against them. I will tell you everything you want to know. Just please do not send me to federal prison." The entire room went dead silent again. The extended family stared in absolute horror as Andre publicly threw his own wife and mother-in-law under the bus without a single second of hesitation to save his own skin. Jasmine stopped crying. She stared at her husband, her face twisting from sorrow into pure, unfiltered rage. "You absolute coward," she shrieked, struggling against the agent holding her. "You promised we would be rich. You told me the shell companies were untraceable. You ruined my life, Andre. I hate you." Patricia looked between her daughter and her son-in-law, her perfectly constructed fake reality collapsing into a pile of ash. The golden child and the wealthy, successful husband were currently screaming profanities at each other in handcuffs, completely destroying the flawless family image she had spent 35 years building. I stood up from my chair, slowly smoothing down the fabric of my pristine black funeral dress. I reached into my leather purse and pulled out the heavy ivory envelope sealed with the broken red wax. I walked around the shattered glass on the floor and approached my Uncle George, who was standing near the wall, trembling. I handed him the thick, watermarked document. "This is my grandfather's real will." I said, my voice steady and clear, so the entire family could hear me. He had a corporate law firm in Chicago draft it months ago to bypass Patricia entirely. He left the entire commercial real estate portfolio, the holding company, and all the liquid assets directly to me. Uncle George took the document with shaking hands, his eyes scanning the dense legal paragraphs. He looked up at me, his jaw dropping, as he read the final clause. "What about Patricia and Jasmine?" he asked in a hushed whisper. I looked at my mother, who was now being marched toward the door by 2 federal agents. "He left them exactly $1 each," I replied. "Because that is exactly what their greed is worth." Right at that moment, the restaurant maitre d' stepped nervously into the private dining room, holding a black leather checkbook. He looked absolutely terrified by the presence of the FBI, but he was clearly under strict orders from management to collect the payment for the lavish multi-course feast. He approached the table cautiously, his eyes darting between the ruined centerpieces and the handcuffed guests. "The bill for the evening is $4,200, he announced, his voice shaking slightly. "The credit card Mrs. Thomas provided on file has just been declined by the issuer." Of course it had. Agent Rollins had completely frozen all of their accounts the moment the raid began. Patricia was now officially broke. I reached into my purse one last time. I pulled out a sleek, heavy metal black card. It had been freshly issued to me that morning by Mr. Harrison, linked directly to the massive corporate holding company I now completely owned. I stepped forward and handed the heavy metal card to the maitre d'. "Put the entire dinner on this," I instructed smoothly. "And please add a 20% gratuity for the waitstaff. They had to deal with a terrible mess tonight." The maitre d' bowed his head deeply, taking the card with immense relief. He processed the payment on his handheld terminal and handed the card back to me along with the receipt. I signed my name at the bottom, tearing off my copy and slipping the black card back into my purse. I turned around to leave. The federal agents were escorting my family out of the room. Patricia was walking ahead of me, her head finally bowed in total defeat, her expensive emerald gown dragging heavily across the floor. In her panic, she had dropped her expensive designer purse on the carpet near the doorway. I did not stop. I did not step around it. I walked forward and planted my sensible black shoe directly onto the expensive leather of her purse, stepping right over it as I crossed the threshold. I did not look back at her. I did not look back at Jasmine or Andre. I left them in the ruins of their own making, surrounded by the judgment of the family they had tried so hard to impress. I walked out through the main dining room of Le Petit Palais, ignoring the stares of the wealthy patrons. I pushed open the heavy brass front doors and stepped out into the cool, crisp night air. The city lights sparkled against the dark sky, and the distant sound of sirens echoed down the block. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the clean evening air. The heavy, suffocating burden of 35 years of emotional abuse, gaslighting, and feeling entirely worthless was completely gone. My grandfather had given me the sword, and I had finally cut them down. I walked down the street, a 35-year-old woman who was finally free, incredibly wealthy, and completely at peace.